Months had passed since the night Greg Dawson pulled over Marcus Johnson. The ripple effects of that single traffic stop continued to shape lives, not just those directly involved, but the entire police department and the wider community. Change was slow, messy, and often painful, but it was happening. And for Marcus, that was enough to keep him moving forward. The reforms he championed were starting to take root. Body cameras became standard issue for all officers, ensuring transparency during interactions with the public. Bias training sessions evolved from mandatory lectures into meaningful discussions where officers confronted their own prejudices and learned how to approach situations more fairly. Traffic stop data was analyzed regularly, revealing patterns that helped identify areas needing improvement. Community forums played a key role in rebuilding trust. These gatherings brought together citizens and officers in open dialogue, fostering understanding on both sides. At first, tensions ran high. Some attendees voiced anger and frustration, while others expressed skepticism about whether real change would ever come. But over time, honest conversations began to bridge the gap. People shared stories, asked questions, and listened, not always agreeing but finding common ground nonetheless. One evening, Marcus addressed a packed auditorium during one of these forums. Standing behind a podium adorned with a banner reading "Building Trust, a Path Forward," he spoke with quiet conviction. "Change isn't easy," he began, his voice carrying across the room. "It requires effort, patience, and courage. But I believe we're capable of it. Together, we can create a system where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued." The crowd listened intently, many nodding in agreement. Some clapped softly after his remarks, while others scribbled notes or whispered thoughts to their neighbors. Seated near the front, Lieutenant Amanda Hayes watched with pride. She had seen firsthand how much work Marcus had put into this cause, and she knew none of it would have been possible without his determination. After the event, Marcus mingled, with attendees shaking hands and exchanging ideas. A young mother approached him holding her child's hand tightly. Her eyes glistened with emotion as she thanked him for standing up for justice. "You give us hope," she said simply, her voice trembling. "Hope that things can get better." Marcus smiled warmly, though he felt humbled by her words. "We're all working toward a better future," he replied, "and your support means everything." Meanwhile, Greg Dawson's life had taken a dramatically different turn. After losing his badge, he struggled to find stable employment. His attempts to land jobs in private security or even retail fell flat. Employers hesitated when they saw his record. Eventually, he settled for a position as a mall security guard, a far cry from his days patrolling the streets. At first, Greg resented the job, feeling bitter about how far he'd fallen. But as weeks turned into months, he started to see it differently. Working in a quieter environment gave him time to reflect, to think about the choices he'd made and the impact they'd had on others. He realized that his old habits, the biases he'd carried for so long, hadn't just hurt people like Marcus. They had damaged his own life too. One afternoon, while monitoring security cameras at the mall, Greg noticed a group of teenagers loitering near the food court. Instead of rushing over to confront them as he might have done in the past, he approached calmly and struck up a conversation. To his surprise, they responded positively, opening up about their struggles and dreams. For the first time in years, Greg felt like he was making a genuine connection rather than flexing his authority. Small moments like these began to shift his perspective. He still wrestled with guilt and regret, but he also recognized an opportunity to grow, to become someone who earned respect, not through intimidation, but through kindness and fairness. Back at the precinct, the legacy of the investigation into Greg's conduct lingered. Officers who had once dismissed complaints about racial profiling now took them seriously. Accountability measures ensured that misconduct was addressed swiftly and transparently. While some grumbled about increased oversight, most acknowledged that the changes had improved morale within the ranks and strengthened relationships with the public. Marcus continued leading the charge for reform, using his platform to advocate for policies that extended beyond the department. He worked with local lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at reducing systemic inequities in policing. His efforts earned recognition nationwide, inspiring other cities to follow suit. One evening, as Marcus prepared to leave the precinct, Amanda stopped him in the hallway. "You've done incredible work," she said sincerely. "But don't forget to celebrate the victories, no matter how small they seem." Marcus chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Victories feel few and far between, sometimes," he admitted. "But every step counts, right?" "Absolutely," Amanda agreed. "And you've taken plenty of steps. Keep going. You're making history." As Marcus drove home that night, he reflected on how far they'd come. There was still work to be done, challenges to face, and setbacks to overcome. But amidst the struggle there was hope, a belief that tomorrow could be brighter than today. For Greg, redemption remained a distant goal, but he was determined to pursue it. On his days off, he volunteered at a local youth center, mentoring kids who reminded him of his younger self. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave him purpose. Slowly, he began to rebuild his sense of self-worth, one small act of kindness at a time. In the end, both men found themselves transformed by the events that had unfolded. Marcus emerged as a leader committed to justice and equality, while Greg embarked on a journey of self-reflection and growth. Their paths never crossed again, but their stories intertwined forever, a testament to the power of accountability, resilience, and the possibility of change. As dawn broke over the city, casting light on its streets and neighborhoods, hope flickered in unexpected places. Officers greeted citizens with smiles instead of suspicion. Families walked freely, feeling safer than they had in years. And somewhere in the distance, two men, one driving home from a long day's work, the other clocking in for a new beginning, shared a silent understanding. The road ahead was long but worth traveling. Greg Dawson sat alone in his living room, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. It had been weeks since the traffic stop that changed everything, but the fallout showed no signs of slowing. Suspended from duty and facing termination, he spent most of his days replaying the events in his mind, searching for answers or excuses that would somehow justify what he had done. The viral video haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see himself leaning into Marcus's car, hear his own voice dripping with hostility. He remembered the look in Marcus's eyes, calm, composed, almost pitying, and it made him cringe. How had he not realized who Marcus was? If he'd known then what he knew now, would he have acted differently? Probably not, he admitted to himself bitterly. His behavior that night wasn't about Marcus being the head of internal affairs. It was about the assumptions he'd made based on appearances, and those assumptions had cost him dearly. As the investigation dragged on, more details emerged about Greg's past conduct. Complaints from citizens accusing him of racial profiling, excessive force, and verbal abuse surfaced one after another. Many had been dismissed or swept under the rug, but now they were impossible to ignore. Each new revelation felt like another nail in his coffin. One evening, as Greg sat nursing a glass of whiskey, he opened the envelope marked "Notice of Termination." Inside was a formal letter stating that his employment with the police department was being terminated effective immediately due to gross misconduct. Reading the words hit him like a punch to the gut. For years, being a cop had defined him. It was his identity, his pride. Now, it was gone. He crumpled the letter in his fist and threw it across the room, letting out a frustrated growl. But even as anger surged through him, a small part of his mind whispered something he didn't want to acknowledge. Maybe he deserved this. Over the next few days, Greg found himself reflecting on his career. He thought about the people he'd helped, the victims of crime, the families he'd protected, and tried to cling to those memories. But they were overshadowed by darker ones. The times he'd let bias cloud his judgment. The moments when he'd used his authority to intimidate, rather than protect. He wondered if anyone else saw him the way he saw himself now, not as a hero, but as someone who had abused their power. Had his colleagues noticed? His friends? His family? The thought filled him with shame. One afternoon, Greg decided to visit his older brother, Paul, hoping for some kind of solace. Paul lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, far removed from the chaos of the city. When Greg arrived, Paul greeted him warmly, though concern flickered in his eyes. "You look terrible," Paul said bluntly as they sat down in the kitchen. "What's going on?" Greg hesitated, unsure where to begin. Finally, he sighed and said, "I messed up, Paul. Big time." Paul listened quietly as Greg recounted the traffic stop, the investigation, and the loss of his job. When Greg finished, there was a long silence. Then Paul leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, you screwed up," Paul said finally. "But you're not the only one. There are plenty of cops out there who've done worse and never faced consequences. You're getting a second chance whether you like it or not. What are you going to do with it?" Greg stared at the table, considering his brother's words. Second chances weren't something he was used to thinking about. For so long he'd believed that being a cop meant always being right, always being in control. Admitting fault felt like weakness. But maybe it was strength instead. "I don't know," Greg admitted softly. "I just know I can't keep living like this." Meanwhile, Marcus continued pushing for reform within the department. The bias training sessions began, led by experts who challenged officers to confront their prejudices and rethink how they interacted with the public. Some officers embraced the process, eager to learn and grow. Others resisted, grumbling about political correctness and unnecessary scrutiny. Despite the resistance, Marcus remained steadfast. He worked closely with community leaders, organizing forums where citizens could voice their concerns directly to law enforcement. These meetings weren't always easy. Emotions ran high, and trust was hard to rebuild, but they were a step in the right direction. Amanda Hayes became one of Marcus's strongest allies during this time. Together, they reviewed policies, implemented new procedures, and ensured accountability measures were enforced consistently. Slowly but surely, the culture within the department began to shift. Public perception started to change as well. While some people remained skeptical, others praised the efforts to address systemic issues. Local news outlets covered the reforms extensively, highlighting both progress and challenges. The viral video that had sparked outrage initially now served as a catalyst for positive change. For Marcus, the journey was far from over. There were still obstacles to overcome, battles to fight. But every small victory reminded him why he had taken on this role, to create a system where everyone, regardless of race or background, could feel safe and respected. Late one night, as Marcus prepared to leave the precinct, Amanda stopped him in the hallway. "You've accomplished a lot in a short amount of time," she said with a smile. "How are you holding up?" Marcus chuckled tiredly. "Honestly, I'm exhausted, but I believe we're making a difference. That's what keeps me going." Amanda nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Just remember to take care of yourself too. Change doesn't happen overnight, and you're going to need all the energy you can muster." Marcus thanked her and headed home, feeling a mix of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it head-on. Back at his house, Greg sat alone once again, staring at the wall. He didn't know what the future held for him, but for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to think about possibilities. Maybe he couldn't undo the harm he'd caused, but he could try to make amends. Maybe losing his badge wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. As the night stretched on, both men reflected on the paths they had taken and the choices that lay ahead. For Marcus, the fight for justice continued. For Greg, redemption seemed distant but not impossible. And while their stories were vastly different, they shared one thing in common: the hope that tomorrow could be better than today. The days following the traffic stop were a whirlwind of activity for Marcus. As the newly appointed Chief of Internal Affairs, he threw himself into his work, determined to turn the incident into an opportunity for meaningful change. He knew that simply punishing Greg Dawson wouldn't solve the larger issues plaguing the department. It would take systemic reforms to create lasting impact. Marcus called a department-wide meeting to discuss his plans. Officers from all ranks filed into the conference room, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Some muttered under their breath, questioning why they had to attend. Others sat stiffly, arms crossed, clearly unhappy about being lectured on topics they felt were exaggerated or unnecessary. At the front of the room, Marcus stood tall, projecting calm authority. Beside him, Lieutenant Amanda Hayes watched silently, her presence lending support to his efforts. When everyone was seated, Marcus began speaking. "I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame," he started, his voice steady and clear. "What happened between Officer Dawson and me wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern that needs to end. Our job is to protect and serve, but too often, we fail to live up to that responsibility." He paused, letting his words sink in. Around the room, some officers shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward, intrigued despite themselves. To rebuild trust, not just with the public but within this department, we need to make changes. Marcus continued. "Starting today, I'm implementing mandatory bias training for every officer. We'll also expand the use of body cameras to ensure transparency during interactions with citizens. And finally, we'll conduct regular reviews of traffic stop data to identify any patterns of discrimination." A murmur rippled through the room. Some officers nodded approvingly, recognizing the value of these measures. Others scowled, muttering complaints about political correctness or unnecessary bureaucracy. One officer raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, I understand the goal, but won't this create more paperwork and slow us down? We're already stretched, thin as it is." Marcus acknowledged the concern with a nod. "It's true that these steps will require effort, and yes, there may be growing pains. But think about it. If we don't address these problems now, they'll only get worse. Trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy. Isn't it worth doing whatever it takes to earn back the respect of the communities we serve?" The officer lowered his hand, looking thoughtful. Not everyone was convinced, but Marcus could see that his message was starting to resonate with at least some of them. After the meeting, Marcus met privately with Amanda to review progress on the investigation into Greg's conduct. They pored over documents detailing past complaints against him, many of which had been dismissed or ignored. It became clear that Greg wasn't the only problem. The system itself allowed misconduct to go unchecked. "We can't fix everything overnight," Amanda admitted, rubbing her temples. "But we have to start somewhere. What do you suggest we focus on first?" Marcus thought for a moment before replying. "Accountability. Right now, officers know they can act without consequence, because investigations drag on or get buried. We need to streamline the process and hold people responsible when they break the rules." Amanda agreed, though she warned him that resistance would be fierce. "You're stepping on toes, Marcus. People don't like having their mistakes exposed, especially when those mistakes have gone unpunished for so long." "I know," Marcus said firmly. "But if we want real change, we can't shy away from uncomfortable truths. This isn't just about Greg, it's about setting a standard for everyone." As word of Marcus's initiatives spread, reactions varied widely. Some officers embraced the reforms, seeing them as a chance to improve both the department and its reputation. Others dug in their heels, accusing Marcus of targeting them unfairly. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. Greg Dawson, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. Suspended pending investigation, he spent his days at home stewing over what had happened. At first, he clung to denial, insisting that Marcus had provoked the confrontation and that he was being made a scapegoat. But as evidence mounted, including witness statements and the viral video, he began to realize the gravity of his actions. Late one night, unable to sleep, Greg sat alone in his living room staring at the wall. His mind replayed Pian Duan. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with whispers about what had happened the night before. News of Marcus's encounter with Greg spread quickly among the officers, though details were sketchy and opinions varied wildly. Some believed Greg had overstepped his bounds, while others dismissed the incident as no big deal. What everyone agreed on, however, was that things were about to get messy. Marcus arrived at the station early, determined to file a formal complaint against Greg, and the other officers involved. He walked into the building with quiet confidence, ignoring the stares and murmurs from the staff. His presence alone seemed to command attention, and he knew that people were curious, not just about who he was, but also about why he was there. Lieutenant Amanda Hayes greeted him at the entrance. She led him to a private conference room where they could talk without interruptions. The room was small but functional, with a large table surrounded by chairs. Papers and folders cluttered the surface, evidence of the many cases handled within. These walls. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Johnson," Amanda said as she closed the door behind them. "I want to assure you that we take this matter very seriously." Marcus nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant, but I need more than assurances. This kind of behavior can't continue unchecked." Amanda sighed, sitting down across from him. "You're absolutely right. Unfortunately, incidents like this aren't uncommon, though they rarely receive this level of scrutiny." She hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I'll be honest with you. This department has its share of problems. Bias, misconduct, lack of accountability. These are issues we've been struggling to address for years." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "Then let this be the turning point," he said firmly. "People are watching now. That video has gone viral, and public pressure is mounting. If you don't act decisively, it won't just reflect poorly on Officer Dawson, it'll tarnish the entire department." Amanda nodded grimly. She understood the stakes better than anyone. Public trust in law enforcement was already fragile, and scandals like this only made it worse. Still, change wouldn't come easily, especially when some officers resisted any form of reform. "I agree," she said finally. "Which is why I'm going to recommend a full internal investigation into Officer Dawson's conduct, not just last night, but his entire record. We'll also review policies related to traffic stops and use of force protocols to ensure something like this doesn't happen again." Marcus listened intently, weighing her words. While he appreciated her willingness to cooperate, he wasn't naive enough to think the process would be smooth. Change always faced resistance, particularly in institutions as entrenched as the police force. "What about accountability?" he asked. "How do you plan to hold officers accountable when complaints arise?" Amanda tapped her fingers lightly on the table, considering the question. "That's where you come in," she admitted. "As the new head of internal affairs, your role will be crucial. You'll oversee investigations, recommend disciplinary actions, and work directly with community leaders to rebuild trust. It won't be easy, but if anyone can make a difference, it's you." Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised by her candor. "You're putting a lot of responsibility on my shoulders," he remarked dryly. "It's a responsibility you've earned," Amanda replied. "Besides, you've already proven you're not afraid to stand up for what's right. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need right now." For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was an opportunity to create real, lasting change, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. As they continued discussing next steps, Greg Dawson sat slumped in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee he barely touched. He hadn't slept all night, haunted by memories of the traffic stop and dreading the fallout. When Amanda called him into her office later that morning, he went reluctantly, his stomach churning with anxiety. "Sit down, Dawson," Amanda instructed, as he entered. Her tone was cold, leaving no room for argument. Greg sank into the chair opposite her desk, avoiding eye contact. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He knew he was in trouble, but he couldn't bring himself to admit fault. "Explain yourself," Amanda demanded bluntly. "What possessed you to escalate a simple traffic stop into whatever that was last night?" Greg shifted uncomfortably, searching for an excuse. "I was just doing my job, ma'am," he mumbled. "I thought something seemed off about him. His car, his attitude. So you decided to harass him based on a hunch?" Amanda interrupted sharply. "Do you realize how reckless that was? Not to mention illegal?" Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Amanda cut him off again. "Let me spell it out for you. Marcus Johnson isn't just any citizen. He's the newly appointed Chief of Internal Affairs. Do you understand what that means? Every decision you made last night, from questioning his motives to calling backup, is under scrutiny. And trust me, it doesn't look good. Greg's face turned pale as the reality of his mistake sank in. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. For the first time in his career, he felt truly vulnerable. "What happens now?" he asked weakly. "That depends on the investigation," Amanda replied. "But I can tell you this much. Your actions have consequences. Expect suspension pending further review, and don't be surprised if this leads to termination. You brought this on yourself, Dawson." Greg stared at the floor, unable to respond. As Amanda dismissed him, he returned to the break room, feeling like a ghost of his former self. His colleagues avoided making eye contact, their silence speaking volumes. Word had gotten around about Marcus's position, and Greg suddenly found himself isolated, even among those who once supported him. Meanwhile, the viral video of the traffic stop dominated social media. People shared it thousands of times, adding their own commentary about systemic racism and police misconduct. Community leaders organized protests outside the precinct, demanding justice for Marcus and accountability for Greg. Reporters camped out near the station, eager to capture every development. Inside the building, tensions ran high. Officers debated whether Greg deserved punishment or if he was being unfairly targeted. Some argued that Marcus had provoked the confrontation, while others acknowledged that Greg's behavior was unacceptable regardless of the circumstances. The division highlighted deeper issues within the department, underscoring the need for reform. Marcus spent the rest of the day meeting with key figures in the department, laying groundwork for the changes he intended to implement. He proposed mandatory bias training for all officers, increased use of body cameras, and regular reviews of traffic stop data to identify patterns of discrimination. Though some resisted his ideas, others welcomed the opportunity to improve. By evening, exhaustion set in, but Marcus refused to slow down. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to fight. As he left the station, he passed by Greg, who stood near the exit, staring blankly at the ground. Their eyes met briefly, and for a split second, Greg looked almost remorseful. But Marcus didn't linger. He climbed into his car, started the engine, and drove away, his mind focused on the future. Change was coming, and he planned to lead the charge. As the city lights blurred past his windshield, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about creating a system where everyone, regardless of race or background, could expect fairness and respect. It was a daunting task, but Marcus believed it was possible. And with determination burning in his chest, he vowed to see it through, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The air was thick with tension as Marcus stood outside his car, facing the group of officers. His heart raced, but he kept his breathing steady and his expression calm. He knew that showing fear or anger would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on maintaining control of himself, of his words, and of the situation. Greg stepped closer, his posture rigid and confrontational. "Listen," he growled, jabbing a finger toward Marcus. "You don't get to tell us what we can and can't do. We're the ones enforcing the law here." Marcus didn't flinch. He met Greg's glare with unwavering composure. "And I'm simply exercising my rights," he replied evenly. "Unless you have probable cause to detain me, this conversation is over." The other officers exchanged uneasy glances. They could sense the hostility radiating from Greg, but they also noticed something unusual about Marcus. Unlike most people who found themselves in similar situations, Marcus wasn't backing down. There was a quiet authority in his voice, confidence that made them question whether they were missing something important. One of the officers, a younger man named Ryan, cleared his throat nervously. Greg," he said hesitantly, "maybe we should just write him a ticket and let him go. He hasn't done anything wrong." Greg whipped his head around, glaring at Ryan. "Stay out of this," he snapped. "I know what I'm doing." Ryan fell silent, shifting uncomfortably where he stood. He didn't want to cross Greg, but deep down he agreed with Marcus. This whole thing felt unnecessary, even reckless. Still, he kept his thoughts to himself, not wanting to escalate the situation further. Meanwhile, the third officer, a woman named Lisa, scribbled notes on her clipboard. She had been observing quietly, trying to assess the dynamics between Greg and Marcus. Something about the way Marcus carried himself caught her attention. He didn't seem like someone who would break the law or put up with being treated unfairly without fighting back. Greg turned his focus back to Marcus, refusing to let the matter drop. "You think you're so smart, huh?" he sneered, acting all high and mighty, talking about your rights. "Well, let me tell you something. I've seen plenty of guys like you try to pull this crap. And guess what? It never works." Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying Greg with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Guys like me?" he repeated, his tone measured but laced with sarcasm. "What exactly does that mean?" Greg hesitated for a split second, realizing too late that he might have said too much. But instead of backing off, he doubled down. "You know what I mean," he muttered, avoiding direct eye contact. "People who think they're better than everyone else, driving fancy cars and acting like they're untouchable." Marcus shook his head slowly, almost pityingly. "This isn't about my car, officer. It's about respect. You pulled me over for speeding, which I admitted to. But now you're accusing me of things I haven't done, treating me like a criminal because of how I look. That's not justice. It's prejudice." Greg's face reddened, and he clenched, his fists at his sides. He hated being called out, especially in front of his colleagues. "Don't lecture me about justice," he spat. "You have no idea what it's like out here dealing with scumbags every day. If you ask me, you fit the profile perfectly." That comment struck a nerve, not just with Marcus, but with Lisa and Ryan as well. Lisa stopped writing mid-sentence, her pen hovering above the paper. Ryan shifted uncomfortably again, looking anywhere but at Greg. Even the passerby recording the incident from their car winced, knowing full well how inflammatory Greg's words sounded. Marcus took a step forward, closing the gap between himself and Greg. His movements were deliberate, calculated. "Let me make one thing clear," he said, his voice low but firm. "I may not know everything about your job, but I do know this. Profiling someone based on their race is illegal, and if you keep pushing this, you'll regret it." Greg scoffed, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Before Marcus could respond, the sound of another siren cut through the night. Everyone turned to see a fourth patrol car pulling up behind the others. Out stepped Lieutenant Amanda Hayes, a stern-looking woman in her late 40s. Her presence immediately shifted the energy of the scene. Amanda surveyed the situation quickly, taking in the flashing lights, the cluster of officers, and Marcus standing calmly amidst the chaos. She recognized him instantly, the new head of internal affairs. She had attended a meeting earlier that day where his appointment was announced, and she knew exactly who he was. "What's going on here?" Amanda demanded, her sharp gaze landing on Greg. Greg opened his mouth to explain, but before he could speak, Marcus stepped in smoothly. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said, nodding respectfully. "I assume you're aware of what's happening." Amanda nodded curtly, then turned to Greg. "Dawson, care to fill me in?" Greg stammered, suddenly flustered. Yes, ma'am, I pulled this guy over for speeding, but, He trailed off, unsure of how to justify the escalation. "But nothing," Marcus interjected. "Officer Dawson detained me unnecessarily, accused me of crimes I didn't commit, and refused to provide a valid reason for his actions. All of which has been recorded by a witness." At the mention of a recording, Greg's face paled. Amanda raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Is that true, Dawson?" she asked sharply. I was just following protocol," Greg protested, weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. Amanda sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Protocol doesn't include harassing citizens or making baseless accusations," she said firmly. Turning back to Marcus, she offered a sincere apology. "Mr. Johnson, I apologize for Officer Dawson's behavior. This won't happen again." Marcus inclined his head slightly, accepting the apology but not letting his guard down completely. "Thank you, Lieutenant. However, I expect this matter to be addressed appropriately." "Of course," Amanda assured him. "Rest assured there will be consequences." With that, she ordered Greg and the other officers to return to their vehicles. As they dispersed, Marcus climbed back into his sedan, his hands gripping the TEU steering wheel tightly. Despite the resolution, he couldn't shake the frustration bubbling inside him. This wasn't the first time he'd faced discrimination, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But tonight, he vowed, would be different. Once the officers were gone, the passerby who had recorded the incident approached Marcus cautiously. "Excuse me, sir," they said, holding up their phone. "I got the whole thing on video. Do you mind if I share it online? People need to see this." Marcus considered the offer for a moment. Then, with a small smile, he nodded. "Go ahead," he said. "Maybe it'll help bring some attention to the bigger issue." As the passerby walked away, Marcus started his car and drove off, leaving the scene behind. Little did he know, the video would go viral within hours, sparking outrage across social media and putting intense pressure on the police department to take action. Back at the precinct, Greg paced nervously in the break room, replaying the events in his mind. He couldn't believe how quickly things had spiraled out of control. What had started as a routine traffic stop had turned into a potential career-ending disaster. And worst of all, he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus somehow had the upper hand. For Marcus, however, the fight was just beginning. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to use his position to push for real change. As he drove home, he thought about the challenges that lay ahead, and the countless others who had faced similar injustices. Tonight, he decided, would mark the start of something bigger, something meaningful. And as dawn broke over the horizon, casting light on the quiet streets below, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change was coming, whether the world was ready for it or not. It was late at night and the streets were quiet. Officer Greg Dawson sat in his patrol car sipping cold coffee from a thermos. He had been on duty for over 8 hours, but his shift wasn't over yet. The suburbs around him were sleepy, with only a few cars passing by now and then. It was one of those nights where nothing seemed to happen, and that made Greg restless. He liked action, even if it meant pulling someone over for speeding or checking license plates. As he drove down a wide, empty road lined with tall trees, his eyes caught movement ahead. A sleek black sedan sped past him, its tires humming softly against the asphalt. Greg glanced at his speedometer and noticed the car was going slightly above the limit, just enough to give him a reason to pull it over. He smirked to himself, thinking about how these kinds of stops often led to interesting discoveries. People who drove fancy cars sometimes had things to hide. Greg flipped on his sirens and followed the sedan until it slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder of the road. He parked his patrol car a few feet behind it, leaving enough space between them. Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped out of the car and walked toward the sedan. His boots clicked against the pavement as he approached the driver's side. The man behind the wheel rolled down his window before Greg reached him. He looked calm, composed, and well-dressed in a dark suit. His face was smooth, and his expression didn't show any signs of panic or anger. This surprised Greg a little because most people got nervous when they saw the flashing lights in their rearview mirror. "Good evening, sir," the driver said politely, keeping his hands on the steering wheel where Greg could see them. "Is there a problem?" Greg ignored the greeting and leaned closer to the window, shining his flashlight into the car. The light swept across the interior, revealing leather seats and a spotless dashboard. Everything about this vehicle screamed money, and that bothered Greg more than he cared to admit. He hated seeing people flaunt wealth, especially when they broke the rules. "You were doing 45 in a 35 zone," Greg said gruffly, not bothering to soften his tone. "Do you know how dangerous that is?" The driver nodded calmly. "I apologize if I was going too fast. I'll make sure to slow down." His voice was steady, almost soothing. But Greg wasn't convinced. Something about this guy rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the expensive car, Or maybe it was the fact that he looked so relaxed despite being stopped by a cop. Whatever it was, Greg felt a familiar knot of irritation tighten in his chest. "License and registration, please," Greg demanded, holding out his hand. The driver reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, without hesitation. Then, after opening the glove compartment, he retrieved the registration papers and passed them to Greg. All the while, he maintained eye contact, his expression neutral. Greg took the documents and stepped back to examine them under the glow of his flashlight. The name on the license read Marcus Johnson. The photo matched the man sitting in the car, but something still didn't sit right with Greg. He glanced at the registration next. Sure enough, the car belonged to Marcus Johnson. Everything appeared to be in order, but Greg wasn't ready to let it go. "You know, Mr. Johnson," Greg began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "not everyone can afford a car like this. How does someone like you end up driving such a nice vehicle?" Marcus blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. For a moment he said nothing, as if trying to process what Greg had just asked. When he finally spoke, his tone remained polite but firmer than before. "I work hard for what I have, officer," Marcus replied. "There's no shame in owning something you've earned." Greg scoffed under his breath. He'd heard lines like that before, and they always sounded rehearsed to him. To him, Marcus was just another person making excuses for living beyond their means. Or worse, maybe he wasn't telling the whole truth. "Well, working hard doesn't explain everything," Greg shot back, narrowing his eyes. "Sometimes people get lucky, sometimes they cut corners, and sometimes—" He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "They do things they shouldn't." Marcus frowned, his patience starting to wear thin. "Are you suggesting something, officer? Because I haven't done anything wrong." Greg leaned in closer, his face inches away from Marcus's. "What I'm saying is, we see guys like you all the time. Flashy cars, flashy clothes, acting like you own the place. But sooner or later, we find out the truth." The words stung, though Marcus did his best not to show it. He clenched his jaw briefly before forcing himself to relax. Getting upset wouldn't help the situation. In fact, it might make things worse. So instead, he chose his next words carefully. "Officer, I understand you're just doing your job, but I haven't broken any laws other than speeding, which I already apologized for. If there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way." Greg straightened up, glaring at Marcus through the beam of his flashlight. There was a long pause, during which neither man spoke. Finally, Greg shook his head and muttered something under his breath. He walked back to his patrol car, leaving Marcus sitting in tense silence. Inside the sedan, Marcus exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. He knew encounters like this happened far too often to people who looked like him. Men in positions of power, like cops, often assumed the worst based on appearances alone. But tonight felt different. Tonight, Greg's behavior crossed a line, and Marcus wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his composure. Back in his patrol car, Greg typed Marcus's information into the computer system. As he waited for the results, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The car was clean, the documents checked out, and Marcus hadn't given him any real reason to suspect foul play. Still, Greg refused to let it go. He decided to push further, determined to prove that his instincts were right. When the database search came back clear, Greg slammed his hand against the steering wheel in frustration. Why did this always happen? Every time he tried to crack down on suspicious behavior, the system worked against him. But he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. He grabbed his radio and called for backup. If he couldn't find anything wrong with Marcus's story, maybe a second opinion would help. 2 additional officers arrived within minutes, their patrol cars parking behind Greg's. Together, they surrounded Marcus's sedan, creating an intimidating wall of flashing lights and uniforms. Marcus watched them approach, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew exactly what was happening here. This wasn't about speeding anymore. This was about control, about sending a message, and Marcus wasn't about to let it slide. As the officers gathered around his car, Marcus opened the door and stepped out. He kept his movement slow and deliberate, showing that he posed no threat. Raising his hand slightly, He addressed the group in a firm but respectful tone. "Gentlemen, is there a specific reason I'm being detained?" he asked. "Because unless you have probable cause, I'd like to leave." Greg sneered at the request. "We're conducting an investigation," he snapped. "You don't get to decide when it's over." Marcus raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by the display of authority. "Actually, officer, I believe I do. Unless you can provide a valid reason for detaining me, I'm within my rights to walk away." The tension between them grew thicker with each passing second. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to handle the situation. They knew Greg had a reputation for being difficult, but this felt excessive even by his standards. Unbeknownst to anyone, a passerby had stopped their car a short distance away. From behind the wheel, they recorded the entire exchange on their phone. The video captured every word, every gesture, and every flicker of emotion on both sides. Little did they know, this footage would soon spark a firestorm of controversy and change everything. For now, though, the standoff continued. Neither Greg nor Marcus showed any sign of backing down, and as the seconds ticked by, it became clear that this encounter was far from over.